Mr. Holtz-Eakin, I noticed the first point that you made was in your opening remarks I thought was interesting, and you cited the complexity of the Affordable Care Act. And I want to follow up on that. You know, one of the reasons that we have this hearing today is because it's so complicated that the administration is calling upon an honor system that just basically says, you know, you all just report in and we'll attribute give that the imprimatur of actuality on it. We'll just assume that what you say is true because it's so big and it's so complex and it's so difficult that the administration can't deal with it. We know that the Congressional Budget Office recently came out and they said in part that some of these elements of the Affordable Care Act are so complicated and so difficult to discern that the Congressional Budget Office can't get its arms around the totality of this impact. And not to indict the CBO, they're just saying this is the reality. And here's the footnote in part says that they can CBO and Joint Committee on Taxation can no longer determine exactly how the provisions of the ACA that are not related to the expansion of health insurance coverage have affected their projections of direct spending and revenues. And then it goes on, isolating the incremental effects of those provisions on previously existing programs and revenues 4 years after enactment of the ACA is not possible. In other words, it's so big and it's so complicated and it's so overwhelming that a few months ago they were able to estimate that the 10-year cost was $1.3 trillion, and now they've just said it's too big. There's no way to get our heads around this. One of the remedies, I believe, and I'm interested in your insight in this, is legislation that I've introduced along with 80 members of the House calling for a special inspector general to monitor the Affordable Care Act. The thinking is this incredibly complicated piece of legislation that implicitly is so complicated that the administration can't get its heads around it, implementing the honor system. Explicitly, the Congressional Budget Office says it's so big and complicated, we can't get our heads around this thing, that I think it's time for us to enact similar to what happened with the Troubled Asset Recovery Program, similar to Inspectors General on Iraq and Afghanistan, and an overall Inspector General to get the information, to report back, and to get our arms around these big questions. Can you give us any insight or thoughts you have, particularly on a large Inspector General and how the need for that? Am I overstating this? Am I overcharacterizing it? How would you think of that?
Well, first of all, I will, issue the caveat that I haven't read your bill, so I won't pretend
it's really good reading. You'd love it.
I'm remiss. I know I should have. The Inspector Generals have been very valuable additions to agencies. They have. And I think the track record of their bringing to light inefficiencies, outright malfeasance, things like that is superb. What's unique about this law is really its breadth. The number of agencies it encompasses, I won't even be able to list them all. You've got DHS, IRS, and the Treasury. You've got HHS. You've got the Social Security Administration. The list goes on. Each of the IGs in those agencies is probably very good and looking as carefully as they can at the operations, but they're not going to see the big picture. They're not going to ask the question, are we seeing an efficient, good faith implementation of the law that the Congress passed and the President signed? It makes sense to me to put someone in that position, particularly for such a very, very large amount of money. I mean, this is an extraordinarily important and large program. It makes perfect sense from that perspective.
Let me just direct you specifically to 3 questions that we've prepared in advance. Is there any entity today that could give us an accurate report of how taxpayer dollars are being spent for this law across the entire Federal government, the interactions with State government and the private sector?
No.
Do you agree that SGMA would bring, that is, this Special Inspector General monitoring the Affordable Care Act, as you've come to understand it, would bring much needed clarity to the law that has been haphazardly implemented and where there's strong concerns about waste, fraud, and abuse?
Yes, because the implementation is now more important than the law. It's been so uneven.
And regardless of someone's perspective on the Affordable Care Act, isn't it a rational thing to say more information as it relates to the implementation of the law is a better thing?
Absolutely.
I yield back.